Good evening, அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group அதோட third meeting last 3 days நடந்தது. அதுல என்ன பேசினாங்கன்றத பத்திய இந்த press conferenceக்கு உங்களை அனைவரையும் வரவேற்கிறேன். We have with us Madam Chandani Raina, Geetu Joshi and Jitendra Singh Raje. All the economic advisors and the director in Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India. So I welcome the panelists and all the media. I request you to help me conduct this press conference in a very orderly and peaceful manner. Thank you. Now to Mr. Rajay.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of Department of Economic Affairs and Ministry of Finance, we first of all thank all the media friends for covering the event extensively from last 4 days. As you are aware, this is the third round of Sustainable Finance Working Group meeting, which held on from 19th to 21st of June in this wonderful city of temples and the historical town of Pallava dynasty. And we have been able to capture the entire culture and ethos of the city by the culture and the dance performances throughout the dinner programs of all 3 days. And definitely we had fruitful interaction for which our two advisors will be giving you the brief. So now I hand over the mic to Chandani Raina ma'am to give a brief on the domestic side events. Thank you.
Good evening. This is the domestic side events were held prior to the third Sustainable Finance Working Group meeting and held on the 17th of June 2023. There were two side events and these were done as part of the Jan Bhagidari events, and one of them was held at RBI Staff College, which was on the India's G20 roadmap on sustainable finance, and the second was held at IIT Madras, and this was about mobilizing resources for meeting mitigation and adaptation action in the context of climate change. And the meeting saw participation of technology companies, of finance companies, of SBI, of RBI, and other venture capitalists, including policy institutions, think tanks that participated and deliberated upon what would be the enabling environment that is required for further scaling up of climate finance in the country. Subsequent to that, we have had two other side events as part of the G20 side events. One of them was on climate tech, which is financing early stage climate technologies. The workshop was primarily to discuss policy measures and financial instruments that could catalyze the rapid development and deployment of green and low carbon technologies. And the discussion involved a large spectrum of organizations, stakeholders on this issue about financing early stage climate technologies. We also had subsequently in the next day on the 20th June a discussion on transition finance, data and metrics for climate aligned investments. Again, that was also well participated by across several stakeholders from India and abroad, and the discussion did help in furthering our understanding, especially in the work that the Sustainable Finance Working Group is doing, and helped us arrive at the outcomes for the Sustainable Finance Working Group. So thank you so much.
Now I'll request Geeti Joshi ma'am to give a brief on the 3 days meeting and outcomes of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jitendra. Vanakkam. Good evening, everyone. Friends, we are pleased to inform that the third meeting of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group under India's G20 presidency successfully concluded today in Mahabalipuram. Mahabalipuram, with its rich cultural heritage, has welcomed us and the delegates with warmth and is in many ways a splendidly vibrant destination that one would love to visit many times. The world looks upon G20 to respond to the growing economic and development challenges by building consensus and delivering concrete outcomes. We have selected the theme of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or One Earth, One Family, One Future. This reflects the spirit of interconnectedness of our planet, viewing the world as one family. The theme also spotlights life, that is Lifestyle for Environment, a campaign which was launched by our Honorable Prime Minister for environmentally sustainable and responsible choices leading to a globally transformative action resulting in a cleaner, greener and bluer future. The Sustainable Finance Working Group aims to mobilize sustainable finance as a way of ensuring global growth and promoting transition towards greener, more resilient and inclusive economies. The working group has been a catalyst to the international sustainable finance policy making agenda and has undertaken constructive work in the last 2 years since its inception in 2021. It must be recognized that finance is a crucial element to achieve our vision and goals of the Paris Agreement and Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. The persistent financing gap acts as a binding constraint in achieving these goals. The Sustainable Finance Working Group is looking at how we can collectively work towards finding solutions for reaching our climate and sustainability goals. This thought is reflected in the priorities we have chosen for our presidency. The SFWG under our presidency has focused on enabling discussions for enhanced financing for climate action as well as other SDGs to achieve a better future for all. Under our presidency, the SFWG has identified 3 priority areas, namely mechanisms for mobilizing timely and adequate resources for climate finance, enabling finance for sustainable development goals, and capacity building of the ecosystem for financing towards sustainable development. The first meeting of the Sustainable Finance Working Group was held in Guwahati, and there we received a broad support for the identified priorities and the agenda to be taken up in this year. In the second meeting in Udaipur, we moved a step further with detailed discussions on the priority areas, which have helped us in firming up our deliverables for this year. The third meeting of the Sustainable Finance Working Group was very significant for us, and I'm pleased to inform to you all that we have successfully finalized our key deliverables for the year. This is a big achievement for us, for the working group and for the presidency as a whole to have delivered substantial outcomes contributing to the international sustainable finance agenda under the G20. During the last 3 days, we had extensive discussions and negotiations on the draft deliverables document, which was shared with the membership prior to the meeting. We had 2 rounds of comments from the members, and based on their feedback, we came out with the document which was discussed at this meeting and stands almost final during this meeting. And of course, members have been given some time to go back, reflect and get their approvals from their headquarters and then confirm the recommendations in respect of all 3 priorities. The presidency, in consultation with the co-chairs, that is USA and China, have tried our best to accommodate and reflect each member's comments and inputs in the final deliverable document. The finalized version of G20 Sustainable Finance Deliverables under the Indian presidency consists of voluntary recommendations which have been finalized through a consensus and collaborative approach. We have broadly made recommendations for a list of options to expand de-risking facilities as well as policies and financial instruments to support private capital for investment in green and low carbon technologies. There are recommendations for the analytical framework for SDG aligned finance, which will complement the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, consisting of recommendations on nature-related data and reporting and social impact investment. The G20 Sustainable Technical Assistance Action Plan and the recommendations made to jurisdictions and relevant stakeholders to overcome data-related barriers to climate investments is also a part of the deliverables document. The outcome of the third SFWG meeting will inform the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors and will be submitted for their consideration and endorsement in their third meeting, which is to be held in Gandhinagar next month. More importantly, the third FMCBG would be followed by the Leaders Summit in September. The fourth and the final meeting of the SFWG would also be held in September in Varanasi, and that will finalize the annual SFWG report. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, if you want to ask any questions, you are welcome. Please.
Worldwide, worldwide, how to will it be this economic finance meeting?
You are asking about the mechanisms for that? Now, what is your question exactly? I could not follow it.
G20 working for a group of meeting, so worldwide, the economic development for will it be? So upcoming generation, please.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yes.
No, if you want
yes,
to ask in
that's
Tamil also, you are welcome. No problem.
அடுத்த ஜென்ரேஷன் சார் இப்போ இந்த மீட்டிங் நடக்குதுல்ல, இப்போ வந்து இப்போ உலக அளவில் 20 கண்ட்ரீஸ் இருக்குது, 20 நாட்டில் இந்த எக்கனாமிக் டெவலப்மெண்ட், அதாவது பொருளாதாரத்து வளர்ச்சி குறித்து இதை பற்றி நீங்கள் என்ன நினைக்கிறீங்க?
அடுத்த ஜெனரேஷனுக்கு எப்படி சஸ்டைனபிள் டெவலப்மெண்ட்டை கொண்டு போக முடியும் கேட்குறீங்களா? He talks about how do we carry forward this thing to the next generation, the economic development, sustainable.
So yes, the G20 is a group of G7 countries, 12 emerging market and developing countries, and the European Union. So it is a very significant group, and it is a premier group for international economic cooperation. And the agenda is actually broad-based, and it covers both the concerns of emerging market economies as well as developed countries. So in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, we have taken up the most pressing challenges of the world today, that is, the climate crisis, or the need for mobilizing finance for climate action, as well as the need to mobilize finances for the Sustainable Development Goals. This is actually as per the Agenda 2030, which we have to reach Sustainable Development Goals in respect of 17 goals which have been identified in the Agenda 2030. So our aim is to mobilize finances, and in that it is actually going to impact the future generations as well, because when we move towards financing for SDGs as well as climate action towards financing for green transition, it is definitely going to lead to cleaner and a more inclusive and a sustainable future for all. So the final, meaning the aim of the Sustainable Finance Working Group is to have a sustainable future for all.
Kirti ma'am, you mentioned about financing early stage climate technologies. Can you probably elaborate what kind of technologies are you looking at? Some more details on that, ma'am.
So the early stage climate technologies are, they could be in any sector, but those that are enabling mitigation, which is to reduce carbon emissions or even remove it from the atmosphere. And it could also be to adapt to the changing weather and climate change that's already started. We are experiencing climatic changes that were not there earlier. So those, how do you adapt to it? So how does agriculture adapt to it? What do you do with your water systems, all that? So technology development in any, so it's actually a large set of technologies across many sectors that could be called as climate technologies. But what is early climate technology? Early climate technology is a technology that is at the is being developed. It is a technology that is being developed. It is a technology that may have been developed but needs to be demonstrated to financial to get resources for scaling up, or it could be at the very initial stages of deployment. So this is the time when technology needs the resource at a concessional rate, at a rate that is that enables it to grow to the scale that we need. So that's early stage climate technology. And so the discussion was on how do we do that, because the normal instruments will not work. The normal instruments of mobilizing will not work. And typically, they say that 50% of the technologies that will actually, be called as early stage, which will be effective in controlling mitigation, will come from early stage climate technologies, which are housed in startups. So these are startups basically. So what enabling frameworks do you provide them to scale up their operations and bring those technologies in the market?
Ma'am, do we have some data as to how many such startups are there in India, ma'am? Any data on that, ma'am?
I think there is data in the Department of, DPIIT, which is in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, which gives you a data on what are the number of startups. But exactly what would be the number of startups in climate space is still, offhand I would not be able to tell you, but yes. I think that has not been estimated. So we do have startups as such and estimates of that, but how many are climate startups is still not.
Raj Suman from from Business Line here. I would like to have a kind of a view as to what has been the major concerns from the international delegates. You talked about the India's view. Could you just give a few pointers as to, are they in sync with what we are saying, or maybe they have a different kind of opinion on this? You talked about the flow of funds into the climate. Do they also subscribe to the same view, or maybe they want a different mechanism altogether? Thanks.
I think the priorities, the presidency does articulate its priorities to the membership. It is the consensus that decides. It's with consensus that a priority, whether to take forward for a particular year, is decided. So we can say that all countries have agreed to take forward the priorities that were set down in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, and that's how we have three broad priorities of climate action, financing climate action, financing SDG goals, and specifically with respect to two of those, and the third being capacity building. So those priorities were broadly agreed, and we've had a discussion, and Geetu did mention that there is consensus on the recommendations as well. So the recommendations go out from a working group to the next level, which is the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, and so there is consensus on that. Geetu, if you want to add.
Broadly, I think you've covered it all, but yes, in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, because we are, the agenda which we have taken up during our presidency is of concern and is equally important to both the developed as well as the EMDs. There was a broad consensus, and the need was felt that while in the last 2 years we were focusing only on climate finance, in this year we wanted to focus, in addition to climate finance, we gave a focus on SDGs, and this is the first time the Sustainable Finance Working Group has gone beyond climate to cover sustainable development goals. And of course, capacity building is a cross-cutting issue and is a requirement equal for the developed as well as the developing countries. Of course, needs are different, and so that is being taken care of in the recommendations by highlighting the fact that the emerging market and developing economies, the country-specific circumstances should be kept in mind, as well as there should be special consideration for the SMEs for complying with any of these guidelines.
Just an add-on, were there also country representatives from other than the G20? Because we see it's not only the focus is for the G20, also some of the non-G20 countries. So could you just specify some of the countries, delegates who attended this?
Yes, so we have, in addition to the G20 countries, we have invitee countries who had attended the meeting this time. So a total of over 100 delegates were present in all for the SFWG meeting, which included the G20 members, the invitee countries, as well as international organizations. Among the invitee countries, we had representation from Nigeria, Morocco, Bangladesh was there too. So there were a few, Oman was there, Netherlands and Switzerland, yeah. So we had quite a few invitee countries also participating, and they did express their views on the agenda priorities.
So if I may add your question about how many startups, so there are about a little more than 92,000 startups in India, and those are registered with DPIIT. So there may be more, but those that are registered with DPIIT are 92,000 plus startups, 600 or so. Yeah.
Hi, this is Vaitishwaran from New Indian Express. So you mentioned about favorable policies for private equity into the climate finance and energy transition. Can you elaborate more on this policy aspect? And you mentioned the discussions with VCs and PEs. So what are their demands? Have they any specific demands in mind?
So in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, this was a side event where we had the discussion where there were panelists coming from various organizations. The discussion was broad built, so it was not as if they were identifying concessions or areas that they wish to ask the government to move, and it was not speaking to the government of India's policy, but generally what kind of frameworks they feel are essential for promoting investments in this particular area. Prior to that, we had a domestic event which was in IIT Madras, where we had various stakeholders, including banks that participated. And broadly, the issues that they were touching about was about the need for regulatory, aspects, and whatever they feel would help in flows of resources. So it was not a ask or a list of things that the government must do, but it was about how we could create an enabling environment, what kind of, let's say, regulatory mechanism might help, what is happening elsewhere which might help in India as well, or what modifications we need on ongoing policy. So it was about that. It was a very informal discussion, and for us to understand from the stakeholders the issues that they are facing.
In the deliverables, you mentioned about the policy measures to promote flow of private capital. So that's what I'm asking about. So what are the policies measures you have suggested to the G20 nations?
Okay, so this is part of the G20 discussions about policy measures that could enable financing of low and green carbon technologies. So the discussion was about what kind of frameworks should governments have, what should the IO's role be, about the need to build capacity in certain among stakeholders, on specific stakeholders, the need for proportionality, that is the need to take into account the special circumstances of certain countries like developing countries, and also from the point of view of SMEs. So the discussion here is about flow of funds from the developed to the developing countries. So it's flow of funds from outside as well as domestic, also catalyzing overall flows. But the focus was on how do you get resources from outside, and what could be done. So there were several recommendations talking about which are the areas, and as I mentioned, specifically the financial actors, or who would actually need to do what in order to create the capacity, to build the capability, to be able to get that resource flow.
Can you give some examples on these recommendations?
For instance, there was the recommendation about how the regulatory authorities as well as the government needs to work with financial institutions to enable flows, to address specific requirements of those financial institutions, have capacity building programs, create awareness amongst the stakeholders of access, and that's what those were. But then they are all available in the public domain. Once it is cleared, it will be available on the G20 India's website as the approved report, and so that will inform you in detail about those recommendations.
When it comes to SDG, we are talking about the government funding and central bank. What about the private sector? What sort of deliberation happened on the role of private sector in this whole exercise?
So the Sustainable Finance Working Group actually took up more of the recommendations which are out for relevant for the private finance, because traditionally social sectors have been financed by government across countries, and there is need to step up private finance as well for SDGs. So the kind of recommendations which we have come out with is like to develop a pipeline of bankable projects, and also promote public-private partnerships and social impact initiatives. There were also recommendations that there is a role of innovative technologies in scaling up of social impact instruments as well, and then the need to have specialized intermediaries which could help in funding the SDGs. So these are some of the recommendations which we have come out with. It also includes, of course, the fact that there is need to have greater experience sharing among members, and the best practices will be shared. In fact, one of the deliverable is to have a compendium on best practices for financing SDGs. So in that, in fact, we are going to come out with a lot of financing models which the private sector has developed or has been successful in financing for SDGs. Thank you.
Ritesh Ranjan from DD News. It is said that there is a gap between data analysts and decision makers to make informed investment decisions, taking into account environment impacts. Is that so? And if it is, what has been done for that?
So what happens is the data requirements have been with climate becoming an important aspect in investment. We want green investments. We want investments into green technology, building of green technology. The investor needs to know what is the carbon footprint of the company that they wish to invest in, so that they do not, so they need to know all of that. They also need to know how much would be the impact of adopting a particular project which has a technology aspect to it, and what would be its impact, and how long would it take to impact the environment, and how much of it carbon would get mitigated, what would its linkage be on its financing, how is it getting the resources to meet that technology requirements. So data is definitely required because this is a new element. Now, finance always needed data, because whenever a company goes to seek finance support from a financial institution, they have to submit their data, which is about their the performance of their company. Now, in a green scenario, what is the additional information that you need to provide so that the investor knows that the resource is actually going for green? It should not be that the investor is not in the know of things about where the investment is happening. So he might have new sets of information that he wants. Now, at present, the contention that is at present, the discussions that are there, is that there is a gap. So what the investor doesn't know everything about the company in terms of its carbon footprint, in terms of its impact of that particular technology, about its about the performance of that company, in terms of its future plans. The organization, the investor doesn't know. And when he's investing in a company for long term on green projects, which are generally long term. He wants to be sure that this is really going to be a green investment and not something else. So that data, there is definitely a data requirement, which is natural that it doesn't exist now, because it does exist, but to the extent possible, or the needs of the financial institutions are perhaps much more. And that's understandable because this is a growing field and it has come up now. So early stage climate technologies, or even climate mitigation investments, etc., are new things. I mean, it was not so much there earlier, about 10 years ago. So it's only understandable that there is a discussion on that. And how do we improve the capacity? How do we, not only that, how do we handhold them through that process? Because every company is at different stage of development, and you need to account for that. So what are the data points that they definitely need? What are those points that they can live without for some time if the company is a small one? what would be the company's transition plans, let's say, if the company is also planning to, over time, reduce its carbon emissions, how is it planning to reduce its carbon emissions? All that data they need. And this data is different from the data about companies' commercial performance alone, or its investment, or its other ties, investors, or others who might be involved in that particular company. So I think that's the reason why this discussion.
I happened to actually speak to some of the delegates. They were saying that they are, it has been discussed in the platform that, 10 years or 15 years later, what would be the climate challenges and all, and how we can overcome that. Can you just put a light on that?
Yeah, so climate is always a discussion is in the future, because it's something that is happening, but we probably not being, aware in our general living so much. We do feel at times that the weather has changed. It's not characteristic to rain in Mahabalipuram, at least now, but is it so? But so we don't know. So we need to look at it futuristically. So, but while we look at it futuristically, we have to prepare now, because we need to set up, we need to start changing, including climate into our decision making now, because if we don't, we won't be ready when the things are actually in 10 or 15 years down the line. So we need to take action now, because all this is happening because of the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And if we keep emitting to the extent, or the world emits to the extent that it is emitting, it might impact. Of course, India's own emissions are very minuscule. They are not as much as the rest of the world.
Any other question? Gaurav Prinkar from Dakshin Prakash here. Madam just told that social impact investment was discussed in the meeting. So how this investment will impact the society, and what will be the fields of society in which the investment is discussed?
Yes, so the social impact investment is essentially for the social SDGs like education, health, water, sanitation, etc. So essentially what we are discussing here in the group is about the financing instruments which can have a better impact on social outcomes, and how to scale up those instruments. Some of these instruments include the impact bonds, sustainability linked bonds. So that's one way to raise and mobilize money so that we have a positive impact on the social sectors like education and health. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, friends. Thank you for very active participation. Thank you very much.